I'm very pleased to have Richard Florida as our keynote speaker, the director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, global research professor at New York University, and the founder of the Creative Class Group. Richard Florida is perhaps the world's leading urbanist. According to The Economist, he is as close to a household name as it is possible for an urban theorist to be in America. Florida is the author of several global bestsellers, including The Rise of the Creative Class, and I think this is what most of us know him as, The Rise of the Creative Class, which has been called one of the best business books of all time. He is a senior editor at The Atlantic, where he co-founded and serves as editor-at-large for Atlantic Cities. He is a regular contributor to CNN and other news broadcasts. In his recent research, Dr. Florida has focused on the importance of an affordable, high quality of life, including affordable housing, for all residents, not just for the creative class, as a fundamental element of an internationally competitive metropolis. Please join me in welcoming Richard Florida.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Thank you. Hi, guys. It's really, really great to be here in the magnificent city of Chicago. The last time I was in this building, I was here with your immediately former mayor, who, it was the first time I was on this campus. And he told a remarkable story, which I'm sure all of you know, but it was new to me, about how his dad, and I remember, if you've read my work, I'm a working class kid. My dad only had a 7th grade education from Newark, New Jersey. And he said, you know, and I was the kind of kid, well, my parents gave me a set of book covers. I went to Catholic school, Queen of Peace boys school in New Jersey anyway. I went to Catholic school. My parents gave me a set of book covers in 1st grade to motivate me with all of these Ivy League colleges. And there was Dartmouth and Columbia and Penn and Harvard and Yale and Princeton. And I thought all of these great colleges were in a faraway land called Massachusetts. Little did I know Princeton was like 30 miles from where I was born. And what the mayor said to me is there were places for really rich and privileged kids to go to school in this town, but there weren't really many places for working class kids or kids for less advantaged backgrounds. And his dad wanted to create this place. So it's always had this university has always had a special place in my heart. And of course, this has been Chicago in general. I'm writing a paper in a new book, and I'll bore you with all of that in a minute. I'm writing a paper in a new book, and the paper's on divided cities and how we've come to be so divided. And I went back, and what did I look at? The Chicago School of Urbanism. And I was writing all about that today on the plane. And of course, this university has a magnificent legacy of urbanists and urbanism. So it's always great to be here. Thanks to Jack, thanks to the Preservation Compact, thanks to Julia Stash for sending me the email that originally at the MacArthur that got this ball rolling. And thanks to the weather for cooperating with my flight today and having no delays. You know, my life has taken some interesting turns in the past few years. As Jack so kindly noted, from my bio, you know, about a decade ago, a little more, I wrote this book called Rise of the Creative Class. And that book came out of my experience living in Pittsburgh and kind of dealing with what I came to call the Pittsburgh paradox. Why Pittsburgh, with spectacular universities, Carnegie Mellon, where I taught for nearly 20 years, this huge talent influx of the best software, computer engineers, robotics people, biotech people, great institutes at the University of Pittsburgh, why it could incubate technology and talent and why it tended to flow away. Now that's happened to turn around, but I wanted to try to understand that, and that led to the book Rise of the Creative Class. And then I wrote the book. I expected it to be a flop like my 5 other books. You know, my mom and dad and brother and relatives bought it. But actually people read it and liked it. And then that book took on a whole life of its own that created something that is not necessarily me, but it created all sorts of debates. People liked it, the people hated it. They liked me, they hated me. They gave me crap, they told me I was great, all of that stuff. So all of that's gone on for the past 10 years. And I think, and what we'll talk about today, is because of many of the very mechanisms myself and Bruce Katz and Ed Glazer and others, other very well-known urbanists have pointed to, Michael Porter, the effects of clustering, concentration, what economists call agglomeration. All of those things have led to this great back to the city movement. Alan Ehrenhalt calls it the great inversion. I'll talk all more about this, but to give you the 2-second, the 2-line version. The upshot of this is that it's caused our cities to revive, not all of them, many of them, particularly caused our bigger cities like Chicago and New York and Boston and San Francisco and Washington, D.C., and even places like Detroit, where my wife is from, where I spend a lot of time, is beginning to see a back to the city movement with these billionaire people like Dan Gilbert, pouring money into the core. And so for urbanists, this was at once a very good thing. People are moving back to the city. Jobs are coming back to the city. Office buildings are coming back to the city. There's new construction in the city. Young people are moving back to the city. Bars are opening in the city. The city's becoming more vibrant. Technology firms, something I'll talk about, and I've actually been tracking this in Chicago as well. Even high technology firms, which are supposed to always prefer the suburbs, are coming back to the city. But, and the big but, which will be you're the first people I just sold my next book in New York 2 weeks ago, and the contracts aren't signed. But my next book is going to deal with this. And this report I'm working on called The Divided City. But, and the big but is, all of these very good things, which are very good things, are causing our cities and communities to be divided in new and even more powerful ways. And ways that go far beyond our vocabulary. We have this bad vocabulary handed down by urbanologists, some of them coming from the original Chicago school scholars of 120 years ago. Words like urban and suburban, which captured my parents' reality, where the city core was becoming less advantaged, more disadvantaged, more high-impacted poverty, more distressed neighborhoods, as white flight and the flight of affluences and businesses moved to the suburbs. And if you read, I read all this stuff, I'm a total geek. If you read like Hoover and Vernon from 1961, the flight of affluence in business, the flight from density to purchase of lower densities. But those words no longer capture this new metropolis, a new city we have, which really has pockets of advantage and pockets of disadvantage. And that's what I want to talk about, and the challenges it poses for housing and for what I would call, in all of our work, I don't have answers to this. It's going to take me I told the publisher Basic Books, it's going to take at least 2 years for me to even think through this book, because it's such a big issue. Part of the challenge is affordable housing, but part of the challenge goes beyond affordable housing to what, and I'm posing this question, and hopefully we can start the dialogue today and carry it on over time. What in the heck a new urban social compact for the new knowledge economy, or whatever we want to call it, creative economy, whatever we want to call this thing, 21st century economy, what would a new urban social compact look like? Because the old one, it's not that the old one is broken, it's that the change in our economy has left the old one very hard to be relevant. So, where do we begin? Look, our economy is going through probably the greatest economic transformation of all time. It's hard for us to believe that because we're living through it, because we can't see the full extent of this transformation. But it's humongous. And when you really think about it, and I wrote a book called The Great Reset a few years ago about this, if you really think about the last several years, from the great financial and stock market and housing and technology crisis of 2008, which I don't call a Great Recession or a Great Depression, I call it a Great Reset, which will continue to have big effects on housing. But what that crisis really represents is not a typical shift in the business cycle. What the crisis that we are living through, and that is still percolating and unfolding, represents is this phase shift from an old economic order that has been faltering and indeed collapsing to a new one. We've had 2 or 3 of these kinds of crisis, what economists call systemic crisis, over the past couple of centuries. The one that we're all very familiar with, my parents drilled into my heads because they were children of this in Newark, New Jersey, is the Great Depression. The Great Depression signaled a shift from a kind of simple industrial capitalism to a more organized kind of industrial capitalism, and we forged a great social compact which gave us many of the powerful things that made our lives better. It brought us a union movement that boosted people's wages, brought us a new way of housing our people, suburban single-family homes and the shift to that. We had about a 45% rate of home ownership before the crash. That went up all the way to nearly 70% at its peak. New ways of organizing our social compact with Social Security, social welfare programs, ultimately the Great Society, and urban poverty and urban cities programs. But the crisis before that is the one that's illustrative. It's the Great Crisis of 1873, the Panic and Long Depression, which really signaled the shifting of the United States from an agrarian nation to a modern industrial society. This is the time when Chicago and Pittsburgh and Detroit and our great industrial, Milwaukee and all of them, all of our great into Cleveland, Buffalo, our great industrial cities exploded as people moved from the farm and then ultimately, like my grandparents, from overseas to our shores. I went back and examined all of these great resets. And I found 2 or 3 things that are conventional wisdom, and one thing which I think is interesting and will be useful for you, for us to remember. First, the conventional notion that what gets us out of crises is massive doses of government intervention is simple-minded at best. That, in fact, it was only in the Great Depression that government came into the economy to help mitigate the worst effects of depression. And in fact, government monetary policy and fiscal policy, more monetary policy, played an even bigger role this time. But there are 2 or 3 things that are key to understanding these periods of transformation. The first one, what the great economist Joseph Schumpeter identified, is that these are periods of tremendous innovation. So people talk about the Great Stagnation, the ending of American innovation, diminishing returns in science and technology. In every case, great crises have given rise to powerful gales of new innovation, as innovations that have bunched up before those crises begin to be unleashed. People know lots about that, have written lots about this. So we can expect, and we are experiencing now, another beginnings of an era of innovation. But the second part of the story is where it gets interesting, where most scholars and economists forget, neglect, don't like to talk about, and which I think is critical for our purposes. These great crises, systemic crises, are what I call great resets, shift our economy not only by unleashing waves of innovation and technology, changing the way government intervenes, getting new waves of spending, whether it's social welfare spending or after the war military spending. They power the economy because they change the way we live. This is what urbanists and geographers call a spatial fix. If you look back to the great crisis that I mentioned of the long depression of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, it was not only the rise of the electronic industry, not only the rise of the new chemical industry, not only massive improvements in steel making and in energy and power, not only the rise of cable cars and subways and rudimentary mass transit, it was the creation of a new way of life, an urban way of life. The settlement and congregation of people in great cities like this one is what created the demand for the goods coming out of our factories. And the one that will be more self-evident to all of us because we remember it more clearly from our parents' and grandparents' stories and memories is the Great Depression. It wasn't just FDR spending programs that set the economy right, though they helped. It wasn't just mobilization for World War II that helped power our economy forward. It was the rise of a new way of living. Some of us may find it quite distressing or appalling. Some of us may complain about sprawl, but the fact of the matter was the spatial fix, the great reset of the post-war era, was the onset of mass suburbanization. That onset of mass suburbanization, and millions upon millions of people took advantage of the then new housing finance system, which created our long-term amortized mortgage, built us a secondary market, all stuff we take for granted today. That movement of people to our suburban periphery powered the industrial engine of the great post-war boom that most of us look back on and say those were the glory days of an industrial working class, of an America that wasn't so class divided, of an America where income inequality was less, where the working class had to go. It was the ability to construct new highways and build new homes and fill them with refrigerators, washer dryers, stoves and ovens, radios and television sets, a car, 2 cars, 3 cars, all of that stuff made in the United States at the time. It was that geographic Keynesianism, that new way of life, that new way of living, that new way of housing our people, which was the key to economic recovery. The economic reset and the economic transformation we're going through today is bigger than both of those combined. Who is telling us about the shifts in our lifestyle, the shifts in our housing patterns, the shifts in our geography that will someday underpin a new economic structure? No one. Our friends in economics are tone deaf. On Capitol Hill in Washington, and I'm a huge fan of the president, I voted twice for the president. You should have seen our election day party in Canada. Poor Mitt Romney. We had my wife had her sisters mule them over the border because we couldn't get a life-size Romney, and my wife's sisters were like terrified that people were going to see them coming into Canada with a life-size Romney and a life-size Obama, so they had to mule them with blankets over them. And everybody wanted to take home Obama, including most of the guys, but nobody wanted poor Mitt Romney. And we literally, there was one American there who was much more conservative than I. I'm an independent, but I voted for the president twice. And we put poor Romney on his lawn the next day. But no one in Washington, whether right or left, Republican or Democrat, is talking about this. In fact, very few people in our cities are talking about this, and there's a reason for it. Because these changes occur very gradually. In fact, these changes, we look back in history and say, oh, yeah, well, you know, the Great Depression, that thing about suburbanization that happened, yeah, that was really important. We'll call it a spatial fix. That helped set the economy on the right path. That meant wages went up and workers had more purchasing power. They could buy a house. They could create demand for cars. They could buy a car. They could buy a washing machine. And the whole system worked well. That took a generation. My dad was born in 1921. He was 8 years old when the markets crashed. He was 13 when he left school in the 7th grade to get a job in a factory, Victory Optical. My dad went off and he fought. He enlisted in the army. He stormed the beaches at Normandy. He fought in all the great battles of World War II. He came back from the war in the 50s. He went right back to work in the same factory. My dad worked at one factory for life, one job for life. Now, the kid who was born in 1921, the crisis that happened when he was 8 years old, gets married to my mom. They met, he was an ice skater. They met in Branchburg Park, the great park in Newark. They met. They got married in the late 50s. I was born in 1957. My mom and dad bought their first suburban home in 1960. Do the math. How old was my dad? Born in 1921, 1960. That 8-year-old boy in 1929 was nearly a 40-year-old man. And he would sit me down on the front stoop at this little house, which we carved into a 2-family, which basically had about 800 square feet of living space plus a basement, 1 bathroom for 4 of us. And he sat me down in front of that house and he said, Rich, you see this house? This was a farm. Now, this is maybe 5 miles from Newark. This was a farm when I was a boy. No one could imagine living out here. No one had a car to get here. Yet, in that neighborhood and countless others like it, up and down the New Jersey Turnpike, our particular exit was exit 15W with the smells to prove it. If you've ever driven the New Jersey Turnpike, you know what I mean. Heart of Sopranos country. I grew up talking like this. How you guys doing here in Chicago? What a great town you are here. This is nice. My Garden State scholarship to Rutgers, I swear to God, is where I learned English as a second language, but it's a topic for a whole other day. Hey, I'm going to college, guys. Why are you going to college? Hey, don't you want to get an education, get ahead? I was like, they don't talk like that here in college anymore. But my dad was 40. It was a generational event. And so the changes we're going through creep up gradually. We look back in history and we see this very compacted process, but we don't realize these changes are very gradual. And back to my main point. This is a bigger economic transformation than those other ones combined. This is a humongous, I don't even have the right vocabulary to say how big this economic transformation is. And why? If you scroll back through all of economic history and you look at the way human beings created wealth, we did it one very simple way for all the millennia, through all of time. We used our hands and our backs and our legs to transform nature. We either settled near fertile river deltas. We began to build little communities. We shifted from hunter-gatherers preying upon nature to agrarian settlements. We built up these little trading towns. And then, several hundred years ago, we went through the Industrial Revolution. We began to take those raw materials, iron ore, river power, steam power, petroleum power, iron ore, coal, and we began to gather those raw materials and use our physical abilities, our physical labor, to make things. Land, labor, and capital, the three great forces of production, Economics 101. When Marx was studying the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism and complaining about its contradictions, what did he say? It was the physical labor of the proletariat that powered capitalism. Not only that, that physical labor of the proletariat is what made the proletariat, the working class, a class. Because each worker doing his or her job together made a product. And the workers would all of a sudden see that they had a universal interest. They would band up together and roll. Well, of course, that didn't happen. But the idea that physical labor powered our economy, and it was the core of what created a common human existence. Raw materials, physical labor, man transforming nature. What's happened in the past half century or so, 30 years, that have puzzled scholars like me, that I wrote Rise of the Creative Class about? What we began to see is this idea of people transforming nature began to shrink as a component of our economy. Many of these manufacturing jobs got automated. Well, you live in Chicago, you know this. You know the great companies that once were here, Motorola. We can go on and on. On and on about the great manufacturing center that was Chicago, or was Detroit, or was Cleveland, or was New Jersey, where I grew up. The dad who worked in an eyeglass factory for more than 50 years. And then we started to move the stuff offshore. And then we got the Japanese Revolution, which I studied in detail during my early years as a professor. The lean manufacturing, continuous improvement, quality, high performance. I did studies for the Council of Great Lakes Governors right here in Chicago about this in the 1980s, met with all the governors then. And right now, China is the world's factory. That's what they call it. That's what my colleagues call it. The stuff we buy is made in China. Well, no wonder that old connection between making stuff in factories, working in the factory, buying the suburban home, stimulating demand, no wonder that broke down, because the stuff isn't really made here anymore. And of course, some of it is coming back. We'll maybe grow another 100,000, 200,000. Maybe we'll get back 1 million of the tens of millions of jobs we lost. But something new happened, right? Over the course of the past 20 or 30 years, we kind of invented or seized upon or gradually grew a new factor of production. That's what my work's been about. Some people said we were moving from an industrial to a service economy. Other really smart people said we're moving from a manufacturing to a technology-driven, high-tech economy. Silicon Valley, Route 128, the high-tech clusters. Others said it's a post-industrial economy. It's a cybernetic economy. It's a digital future. You know, you've read all of this, seen it in the business paper, in the newspaper, watched about it on TV. Information age. And then the great Peter Drucker, one of 2 or 3 people who really influenced my thinking, said, no, what we're really shifting from is a physical economy to a knowledge economy. Very smart man. Came from Vienna, taught at US universities, wrote dozens of books. And the idea was that knowledge was going to be the key factor of production. I made one small emendation to Peter Drucker's. I simply believe, and why I called this the creative class, and remember, the creative class is not just artists and entertainers and young people and this is when I think it's hipsters. Critics are very good at trying to pigeonhole you, especially some critics with their own agendas. The creative class is people who work in science and technology, innovation, research and development, entrepreneurs like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and all the rest. But it also includes people in the knowledge-based professions, healthcare, law, media, management. And it also includes people in arts, entertainment, anyone who works with their mind. Anyone who works like us with our mind, rather than my dad, worked principally with his hands and back and legs. And why did I call it the creative class? One simple thing. If you really think about it, it's not knowledge or intelligence or information that makes us human. In fact, it's not physical labor. See, Marx got this wrong. It's not physical labor that is the key that makes us human beings, our ability to transform and act on nature. In fact, there's something much more basic. If you study Psychology 101 or you study child psychology, you know this. It's something every little boy or girl shares. It's something that Robert Sternberg, one of our greatest theorists of creativity, says if you find a great entrepreneur, business leader, artist, musician, community builder, city builder, CEO, startup, entrepreneur, venture, if you find a person who's great, they share one common trait in common. They're highly creative. It's our creativity that's evident in every single human being. It's something that all of us share. Every little boy and girl, every child, every one of us has creativity. Now, of course, as Ken Robinson has shown us, that can be squelched out. And as we get older, it's just beaten out of us in school and in institutions and all of this. But creativity is the thing that drives our economy and the things that makes us human. It's the things that we all share. It doesn't care about race. It doesn't care about gender. It will not accept the social categories we have imposed on ourselves. That's why creativity requires diversity. Requires diversity. Because all of us contributing, and that's why the most innovative and creative parts of the United States are the most diverse. I use all kinds of crazy indicators. They get me in trouble. Bohemian index, gay index, foreign-born index, interracial index, whatever. I don't care. I love it when people, does Florida really believe yuppies, sophistas, and gays are going to drive our economy forward? Does Richard Florida underline the Judeo-Christian tradition of the family with his damn gay index? No. They're all proxy measures, simple measures of getting at this fact that creativity thrives on diversity. Some basic facts. Since the year 1980, we generated more than 20 million jobs in America. 20 million new jobs in America in the creative and knowledge-based industries. We shed tens of millions of jobs tragically in work like my dad did in manufacturing. The creative class, like it or not now, accounts for over a third of our workforce. And alongside the decline of manufacturing and those good mid-skill jobs, we've seen the rise of two kinds of work. And our society's divided. And now our cities are dividing. One kind of work is this good, high-paying, creative class work. Chicago, the metro, has about 1.8 million people doing this kind of work. The average salary is over $75,000. Now, there are artists that make less, and there are techies and CEOs that make a heck of a lot more. But the average is $75,000. Chicago today, the city of broad shoulders, at one time it had well more than 50%. In fact, if you look at the history of Chicago or of Detroit or Cleveland, the United States, in the year 1900, most of our people still worked on and around farms. By the year 1950, more than 50% of the workforce in this town were working in manufacturing. That has shrunk to 1 in 5. Hold on. The working class has shrunk to 1 in 5 workers in Chicago. And the working class includes everyone who works in construction, transportation, installation, and maintenance. In the United States today, less than 6% of our workforce actually makes things. It's about the same amount that were employed in agriculture in the 1940s. The other great class that has arisen, and about 1 million people do that kind of work, construction, transportation, maintenance, and industrial work in Chicago, in the metro. The other great class that has arisen, and they average about 40,000, which is very high. The rate of pay for working class people in Chicago is It's $5, $6, $7, $8, maybe $10,000 more than the national average. But Chicago's biggest class is a group I call the service class. That's the bifurcation. That's the split. That's the new class divide. The service class are the fastest growing occupations in America. Retail, sales, personal care assistant, like the lady, the Polish lady who took care of my mom when she was dying of Alzheimer's. Physical therapy assistant, you can go on and on. Home health aide, clerical and administrative, all of these positions in Chicago, 2.7 million people in the metro do these kind of jobs. They pay 30 grand. 30 grand. That's the exact same number if you read the report that I read today, right there, the report on affordability. That's the exact same median amount as the median renter. Exact same, $30,900 and some dollars here. Exactly the same number. And that service class doesn't have full-time employment like my dad in a factory with union protection in the main. It has temporary, contingent, and precarious employment. That's the split we're looking at in our society. Now, in my early work, and most of us, not just me, most of us writing in that part of the early 2000s, we're trying to document the incredible potential of the knowledge-driven, innovative, creative economy that looked like it was moving back to cities. Boy, we didn't know. It was like the genie out of the box. We had no idea. The tiger, I'm gonna think of better metaphors. The tiger by the tail when I write this book. This was something no one was prepared for. And if you look at the field of urbanism today, and I'm going to try to get at this in the book, you have a complete split. You have people like me who have been, or Mike Porter, Ed Glazer, who have been arguing for the concentration, clustering, agglomeration, the movement, Allen Hall, the movement back to the city. And it's all happened. Look at Chicago. Every time I come here, I'm flabbergasted. Look at Toronto, where I live. There are more skyscrapers being built in Toronto than all of North America combined. Miami, where we go in the winter, there was nothing in downtown Miami. There's now towers. It looks like my brother-in-law from Detroit comes. When I show him the pictures from 1970, he said, it can't be. It cannot be. That is a new city. Toronto, Chicago, we can go on and on. New York City, London. The movement of technology. This is my next post at Atlantic Cities next week. The movement of high technology out of the edge cities, out of the suburbs, out of what my dear friend, and you know him, you love him, Joel Kotkin, I'd like to give him a hug, he's my brother, called a Nerdistan. The movement of them back from the suburbs of Chicago, I have the data on Chicago, into the inner city, because that's where technology people want to be. The fact that Google built $1 billion headquarters in downtown Lower Manhattan, I can go on and on. It's not Silicon Valley that's the nation's technology leader anymore. It's urban San Francisco. It's Manhattan. It's downtown Chicago. It's Cambridge, Massachusetts, not the suburbs of 128. And that movement into the city, you know, what did the Brookings study say? 27 of 51 major metros have seen faster growth in their cores over the past decade. If you look at highly educated people, a dramatic movement back to the city. The clustering, the concentration is remarkable. We did a series on Atlantic cities. We did Chicago. We called it Class Divided Cities. New York, Class Divided Cities. LA, Class Divided Cities. Chicago. When you look at this concentration of knowledge-based professionals, highly educated people, in the core and radiating, you know, purple is the creative class, red's the service class, you can just see a completely split. Not only is the labor market split, our economy is completely bifurcated. Let me give you some facts on Chicago, on the metro. I have a little backup paper here, but my memory's pretty good, at least short-term memory. I haven't destroyed too much. I told you about 35% of the workforce in Chicago works in the creative class. 40% of the 25, hold on, I'll look at my cheat sheet. I want to get this right for you guys. This is how concentrated these classes are. In 35% of your census tracts, not just downtown, across the metro, the creative class makes up more than 40% of the work of all residents. In 20% of your census tracts, the creative class makes up more than 50%. Remember that I told you the service class is nearly 50%, the lower wage, less skilled, temporary, contingent class. 46% of your workforce, nearly 3 million people. In 23% of your tracts, that service class makes over 50%, represents over 50% of the residents. And the working class. There used to be more than half of this workforce when I was a boy was working class. It's now 20%. The working class makes up more than 50% of the residents in less than 2% of the tracts. And in 20% of your neighborhoods or census tracts, the working class represents less than 10% of your residents. I've looked at this in Chicago, I looked at this in Boston, I've looked at this in LA, I've looked at this in DC. We're building the indices. We are seeing the class clustering on steroids. And it's not just what we used to see in the old suburbs, right? It's not just what we used to see as the movement of the affluent. When I was a boy, my dad with a 7th grade education, working in a factory, I remember when I applied for student aid, my dad's income was $13,000 in 1975. When I applied for student aid and I got a full scholarship to Rutgers, Garden State Scholarship. My uncle, who my dad said was even poorer than him, and my dad was pretty darn poor, it took 9 people, in fact, 9 people to make a living wage in my dad's family. Grandma, grandpa, all 6 siblings, and my dad working in factories and retail shops. Like grandma worked in a bakery. My dad said after the war, as if by magic, his job was turned into a good job through the union movement, through all the things that made his job a family-supporting job. My uncle put himself through Rutgers, Newark, a school like this, at night for a bachelor's of science, and at night for a master's of science. My uncle became the vice president of research at Colgate-Palmolive. He died a multimillionaire. My uncle and my dad married 2 sisters, my mom and my Aunt Lonnie. They lived next door for their entire lives. A rich, successful, knowledge-based professional vice president, one of our most powerful companies, and a lowly factory worker live next door to one another. Go try that one on for size today. Our society is becoming balkanized, concentrated. And in urbanism, we have 2 groups. We have a group sort of like me that was pushing for all the great things that come along with concentration and clustering and agglomeration and the powerful economic effects. And then a group associated with some of my dear friends that I argue with, who were saying, well, but this is gentrification. But this is neighborhood transformation. And have gone a little kooky, to be quite right. You know, they think a good school in a neighborhood's a bad thing. They think cleaning up, graffiti is a bad thing. They think cleaning up crime is bad because it gentrifies the neighborhood. No, those are good things. But they have a point. That this gentrification, and I think gentrification is actually the wrong word. I'm going to grapple for a better one. We're doing a big study with Zillow on the true extent of gentrification. But this idea that at the same time that concentration and clustering creates economic gains, there are winners and losers. Well, we did a study, and I think that's why Jack and Julia wanted me to come today. I published it on Atlantic cities, and immediately my enemy said, Florida has retracted his theory. Florida has gone back. He called himself a liar. That's not what I said. What we did was look at a very simple phenomenon that no one else has done. People have speculated. We looked at the numbers. We looked at the amount of wages these classes make, the creatives on the high end, the service on the falling behind, the split labor market, in concentrated and clustered in great cities like Chicago. Everybody does better. In terms of wages, all boats rise. There is no doubt. No matter what you do, whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or a CEO or an innovator or a professor or a service worker, you're going to do better in terms of wages in Chicago. Better in San Francisco, better in New York, better in Boston. But what we did was factor housing costs into the mix. And then we found a very different outcome. The knowledge and creatives, even though we bitch and moan, we complain that it's harder to live in Chicago or Toronto or Boston and San Francisco or New York. It is. It's expensive as all get out. In Manhattan today, these are mind-blowing statistics. you're looking at the average cost of new construction per square feet in Manhattan, $1,500 to $2,000 a foot. Right now in Manhattan, and this is taking the disadvantaged areas of Manhattan, nearly 50% of the owners of housing do not live in the United States. They are the global super rich. The concentration and clustering effects, the amenity effects, the back to the city movement is creating a world that's not flat, with all respect to Tom Friedman, but that's increasingly spiky, and that spikiness is reflected in a real estate price gradient that is unlike anything we have seen. London is even worse. My friend Ryan Abbott at The Economist has called it a parasitic city. It's a city where increasingly no one can afford to live aside from the global super rich. And it just goes down the chain, from Manhattan to Brooklyn to Toronto to Chicago to DC to Boston and Cleveland and Detroit and all the way down the chain. We're going through a reset which is highly geographic, and that's what I've written about. The one thing we know is the effects of concentration are creating extraordinary advantage to urban location and a big gap between winners and losers. I think it's a mistake, and you guys can tell me I'm wrong, and the time to do it is now, because I haven't started writing. I think it would be a huge mistake to shut off the engine that is bringing us wealth. Do you really want to go back to the Chicago of 1968? Or 1970, or 1970. Do you want to go back to the New York, at the Newark, where I grew up? The crime, the disinvestment, the factory shuttering, my mom's office at the Star Ledger newspaper ringed with barbed wire. Do you want to go back to the Detroit of my youth? Now with Dan Gilbert and others bringing in, it's a complicated problem. But what we have, in the words of Rob Sampson, whose brilliant book on Chicago, every one of you, even though it's an academic book, you need to read it, Great American City, where we have no longer a pattern of center-city distress and suburban advantage, but a pattern of concentrated advantage and disadvantage that spans city and suburb. Where the areas of concentrated advantage are growing and spreading, I use a crazy word, tesselated. They're growing out from one another in blobs and blurbs, and the areas of disadvantage are repelling that, and our metropolis and our city becomes this divided chock-a-block. We have to harness the economic engine for good, and I think this is where housing comes in, and this is where rental housing comes in. You see, the suburban single-family home was the reset of the previous economic order. It wasn't that Americans desired this American dream, it's that the economic order functionally required it. It was the perfect functional analog to mass production capitalism. What does knowledge capitalism require? Not all of us sitting out there isolated in our big-ass suburban homes with our big-ass SUVs, sorry for my French. It requires concentration and clustering. People think this is just a trend, it's a fad. It's the young people want a Prius. The young people want to live energy efficient. The young people want to walk around the city and have bicycles. No, this is required for knowledge work. Knowledge work has always taken place in concentrated and clustered areas. The nature of the work requires interaction, face-to-face communication. It requires density. It's the way wacko artists and bohemians and professors always lived. With the berets on, walking to the pastry shop with the loaf of baguette, and everyone thought they were berserk. It's why so many of these university pockets, not only this one, but the one around the University of Chicago, we know this, has this humongous creative class concentration. It's around USC, it's around NYU, it's around Columbia. We can name any university in the country now that's become this magnet for, and of course, the college towns. Creative work requires interaction. And of course, what we have realized is the single-family home was making us broke. Right? When we add up all the costs of the house and the mortgage and the insurance and the rooms we don't use and the cars that put us over the edge, you know, it's that first and second and third and fourth car that really differentiates between families that can live within their means and families that won't. So what are we seeing? The rate of single-family home ownership is dropping, even in recovery. It hit a high about 70%. And that's coming back. John McElwain at the Urban Land Institute says it's going to go down to 62%. I think it's going to drop even further. My own research suggests, now it's not going to go back to 45%, but my own research suggests that a rate of about when you hit 80% home ownership, you have a stagnant and dead, non-innovative and non-productive community. When that rate of single-family home ownership drops to about 55%, you have a dynamic, engaged, innovative, creative, wealth-creating community. So it's not going from 70 to 0. We're talking about the rate of single-family home ownership going from about 70 to 55%. Well, what's happening? Of course, this shift is putting enormous pressure on the affordable, all the stuff you do, the affordable stock of rental housing. Because what's happening in most of our urban areas is either the stuff is being condoed and turned into owner condo, which then in places like Toronto is then rented out by owners, or it's being turned into high-end rental. And here's one for you. All of my colleagues in economics who simply believe you can solve this problem by building more vertical. You know, these were the same people who believed sprawl was the solution, and if we just sprawled more and built more highways, we'd be great. And now they keep saying, no, density is what we need, and if we just get rid of these atrocious land use and building regulations and build higher stuff, all our affordability problems will go away. Come on. You know better than that. Look at the stuff that's being built in most of our cities. Is it affordable? You tell me. It's high income, large floor plate, extremely expensive. In Toronto, the new stuff that is being built is going for a higher price point than the best single-family homes. Same thing is true in Greater Miami. Same thing is true in New York. The big condos are taking a better premium now than the single-family homes and townhouses. So we got to do two things. And trust me, I'm a professor. I come from the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking. I can talk for all day. Trust me. And I want you guys to have time for questions so we can interact and have some fun. First thing that you know more than I do is that rental housing is going to be an increasingly important part of our new social bargain. Rental housing is going to be something that more and more of us live in and want to live in, especially at those early phases of our careers. So rental housing is something that more and more Americans are going to want to be a part of, and making sure that we have affordable rental housing, particularly in highly clustered and concentrated neighborhoods, is going to be a very difficult challenge. You know this better than I. And it may be that there is a spatial or geographic dimension to this. The second part of the equation is that we're going to have to work on the wage side too. And that's where I think the conversation needs to go in America. At the same time that all of us want to push for more affordable rental housing, better neighborhoods, better access, stronger communities, I think increasingly we have to push on the wage side as well. There's no way we can be successful as a country with this bifurcation in our wages. You know, I told you, 9 family members of my dad's family to make one family wage. My dad comes back for the war, and all of a sudden he has a good job. We turned manufacturing jobs into good jobs. They weren't made that way by magic. We forged a social compact which valued manufacturing workers. I don't see why we can't value service workers, for the life of me. I don't understand why just knowledge workers like me, like us, have value. Why we deserve a premium of more than 3 times what a service worker makes. I don't understand why we value the people who build our cars, create our steel, build our bridges, build our washing machines, make our television sets, most of them in China, by the way, sorry. More than we value the people that make our food, take care of our parents, take care of our homes, take care of us in hospitals. I don't understand these things. These seem like social choices. So the other part of the equation has to be to build a new urban social compact. If not, I fear for our future. If we don't do this, I fear for our future, and I fear for Chicago. Here's why. Firstly, and from the economic developer in me, an urban area that is turned into a suburb, the equivalent of gated communities, gated vertical towers. Come on, we've all seen it. I teach at NYU. I walk the neighborhoods in New York. I see how homogenous they've become. I listen to people bitch and moan at one another. You live in Greenwich, it's a terrible suburb, and you know, and They live in the east side and they live in the same neighborhood, send their kids to the same private schools, do the same set of activities, sit at the same grocery store, shop at the same places, use the same bikes. If our urban neighborhoods become homogeneous and not diverse, there goes the seed cord of innovation, folks. Right out the window. Creativity and innovation require diversity. But worse yet, what's happening to social cohesion? What does Rob Sampson tell us about Chicago? What does all the research tell us about crime and our renovating zones with low crime rates and what Susie Cagle calls our urban sacrifice zones? Chock-a-block. What's happening in cities across the world? Eruptions of protests in Brazil, in Turkey. What happened in London on the eve of the London Olympics? Riots caused by this festering inequality. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to happen in the United States. I'm not saying this is going to happen in Chicago. And at the same time, we're failing to invest in the basic infrastructure and transit and connective fiber that allows people to get around our metropolis. We need a new urban social compact. We need a new urban social compact the same way we needed a new urban policy in the 1960s and 70s. I haven't figured it all out. No one has all the answers, but I can tell you the time to start building this new urban compact that spans housing and transit, community development, and economic development and job improvement is now. And that's my mission over the next several years. Thanks for patience and listening to me. I look forward to your questions. Thank you, guys. Thank you. It's very kind.